Hello, everybody. Welcome to this special edition of the Defense Eye podcast, looking at the opening days of the US-Israel-Iran conflict, which seems to be spreading around the Middle East and into the Mediterranean as we speak. We're just over 2 days into the war, and the outcomes seem ever more uncertain. Francis, what do you think about how this conflict is going to develop? What are the things that struck you as the most interesting aspects of it so far?
Well, bearing in mind prior to the commencement of hostilities, just like Saudi Arabia and UAE had been putting out statements, and you could say this is always what happens. And they said, well, we just believe at this stage, we should negotiate and we shouldn't go for the military option. The fact that pretty much instantly things started, it was firing missiles and drones at every other Gulf country. This had been sort of signaled that Tehran would look to spread the conflict as quickly as possible. I think people were slightly surprised how quickly it did happen. Other one, I think, worth noting, and yes, we are, as you said, only 48 odd hours in, but it doesn't look as if either the US aircraft or the Israeli aircraft had any trouble getting into Iranian airspace. So at the very least worst, the damage done to the Iranian air defense network last year has proved, I won't quite say permanent, but it caused enough lasting damage that entrance, and yeah, do remember, first aircraft from Israel going into Iran, as last year, were not F-35s, they were F-15s and F-16s. They are confident enough to be sending non-stealthy aircraft into Iranian airspace. So, this type of effort shows you that everyone thought Iran, I think us included, thought that Iran's integrated air missile defense network based on S-300, S-400 would prove to be a really tough nut to crack. Not really.
Question, though, is it going to be enough? What we're seeing playing out over the past 2 days, 2.5 days, is is asymmetric warfare in a sense. You have high-tech America, Israel, striking at the leadership of Islamic Republic, the Iranians striking back with their drone and missile attacks across the region. Now, as you say, only 2 days in, but the Iranian counterattack seems to be pretty sophisticated. They seem to be aiming at all the right targets. They seem to have been able to respond, adjust. So that classic, what's the phrase, the OODA loop.
Uh-huh.
So far, both sides are still slugging it out. We haven't seen an impact yet on the Iranian ability to conduct their counterstrikes. So how long before the Israeli and the Americans can degrade that counterattack and exploit that air supremacy? That, we're in a sort of a slugging match, a war of attrition between America and Israel's bombs, America and its Arab allies' interceptor air defenses, and the Iranian missiles and drones. So we're 2 days in, and so far it's going forward. Doesn't seem to be any great trend yet to say if either side is gaining preeminence.
I'll interrupt you straight away. I spoke with 2 friends of mine in Israel this morning, checking in, just seeing how things were. Yeah, they're inured to having to go into the bunkers during this. But both of them said last night was pretty quiet, and both of them are defense attached and whatever. And they said, is it because actually there has already been attrition of Iranian ground-launched missiles of various types? Or is it actually just with air supremacy potentially over Iran, they're finding it difficult actually getting launch vehicles out of maybe protected areas? Now, again, it's only 48 hours in. Of course, it is too early to make, but I thought it was an interesting observation by 2 people whose judgment I trust. But yes, you are right. If you have got Shahed drones or even some slightly more sophisticated ones and so forth, you shouldn't be expending Patriots shooting those down. You should be keeping Patriots for the ballistic missiles and the high supersonic cruise missiles. I think, although you could say the lesson about ground-based air defense should have been learned from Ukraine from 2022 onwards. And here I am very much referring to the UK, where we have no ground-based air defense worth the name. We can go into this in a minute. Could you imagine even one of the sort of Iranian attacks that's taken place against Qatar or UAE, just imagine one of those attacks on southeast Britain and the absolute chaos it would produce. And again, we can go into some of the pathology of why it's not being taken seriously. But I do think the UK at the moment is sleepwalking badly into a situation where we are, I think I say without fear of contradiction, we're the weak link in NATO at the moment.
Well, I mean, it's interesting. Some of the stats coming out of the UAE, Bahrain, Qatar and Kuwait about the number of missiles and drones fired at their countries. I mean, we're certainly on Saturday, UAE was talking about more than 200 drones, almost 150, 160 ballistic missiles, and that same sort of level of effort was replicated across the GCC countries, which is a pretty, several hundred weapons. And they were talking about intercepting 80%. Certainly the UAE said out of those weapons, about 14, 15 got through, hit the hotel, hit the airport, hit the port. We're seeing now reports coming in about the Ras Tunas oil refinery in Saudi Arabia being hit. Kuwait, they've been hit pretty badly as well. And the US naval base in Bahrain, last night, it was still on fire from being hit on Saturday. So these attacks.
Yeah, the attacks relentless, and let's see how long. Because after a while, if just for the sake of argument, Iran is firing 100 ballistic missiles a day against UAE and Saudi Arabia, and then spread across, they're starting to go, so potentially firing 200 to 300 ballistic missiles a day against GCC. So, if they continue at this pace, they've got to have some pretty bloody large stocks. But I suppose the one, I think that, to my mind, one of the most important differences in terms of the logistics, the munitions logistics, is Shahed drones you can probably produce in a average, metalworking facility, and you can scatter the facilities across Iran. And the footprint of, right, these trucks going here, and right, that means this is where the factory is. Very difficult to do because it's all going to be, very low level, like when they split up Spitfire production and moved it throughout the country. Ballistic missiles, that is something where you will be able to say, yeah, it's there, and you'll be able to target them. So it'll be interesting as we start getting videos back from both the Americans and the Israelis, seeing whether they have gone after some of these big production facilities. But I come back to a point. Could you imagine, and I know you're up in the Northwest, so you can put this at Manchester rather than London. Could you imagine the general impact, and I mean physically, mentally, morale, if 10 ballistic missiles hit London, Birmingham, Manchester? Can you imagine what would happen?
Well, it's quite interesting watching the videos of the British tourists in Dubai and the surprise and the shock that they have coming under air attack for the first time ever, even in their lives. I mean, perhaps the locals in the Gulf states are a bit more robust, and they've lived they've had scares before, but certainly for the British tourists in these countries, it was a very, very psychological shock for them.
Completely. Actually, this is where I think we can just move this onto sort of the pathology and the phrasing of when you talk about integrated air and missile defense for the UK. And actually, there was a written answer by the Parliamentary Secretary Al Khan, asked specifically about ballistic missile defense of London. And he gave what is increasingly a common answer, which just said, we have a range of systems to defeat ballistic missiles. Really? Don't think we really have that many of them. I can come on that one in a second. But actually what he said was, and we have a strategic nuclear deterrent which will deter oppressors, our foes. And this line comes out very frequently now. I'm going, so you are directly saying, were there to be some form of missile attack on London, conventional, the UK would go strategic. And I'm going, I don't really think that's going to happen. Another thing I hear more and more, and I think one of the first times it came out was former Secretary of State for Defence Grant Shapps, when asked about ballistic missile attacks on the UK, said, so don't worry, our allies will deal with them. because the missiles have to go over Germany and the Netherlands, they'll shoot them down for us. To which I've spoken with people from both those countries and said, is there an actual agreement that, the ballistic missile defense of NATO, Germany will use its Patriots and other interceptors, Arrow, because do remember, by and large, all air defense systems, especially for missile defense, what they do is they track the trajectory, and this is especially true with the Israeli one. If it turns out that missile is not going to hit your land, or it's going to land in the sea, the system says, not worth firing a missile. Don't worry about it. So would a German or Dutch Patriot faced with a ballistic missile going over them, missing Germany and the Netherlands, would it say, no, we should engage? Or would it say, don't worry, nothing to worry about here? The computer will say it's no threat. Trying to get through to people, this country, in terms of the sort of attacks, you've been outlining, we've been seeing in UAE, the rest of the Gulf states, we are defenseless. The radars, the air defense radars we got, you've got Bulmer up in Northumberland, and that's looking largely north and east, but again, northeast. If you have threats coming from, should we just say, a shadow cargo ship firing drones from the Channel? And before anyone says this is completely unlikely, the French aircraft carrier Charles de Gaulle was on a port visit to Malmö in Sweden last week, and a Russian warship launched drones to go and overfly. Now, they were shot down by the Swedes, but this is not a preposterous suggestion. We are in a new world, and as I say, I just think the phrase we both hear the whole time when you say to people, well, aren't you going to buy more air defense systems? We have to wait for the defense investment plan. I don't see why we have to wait for the defense investment plan. And actually, to be fair, with what we've seen over the new medium helicopter over the past 2 or 3 days, where eventually the chance about, okay, we have to buy it. We don't have to wait for the defense investment plan. This country is cruelly underdefended, and it would, even a dozen Shahed drones hitting bits of London would close the city down, or Manchester, other capital cities are available, would close the cities down in complete panic.
I mean, we're also seeing, and this is, I think, quite an interesting development. The Allied Air Forces, the US Air Force, the British and its other allies in the Middle East are starting to reposition their assets. I mean, before the war, Al Udeid Air Base, Al Dhafra were full of American tanker planes and I-Star planes, rivet joints and AWACS and all those kind of big platforms. Even lots of the fighters were forward deployed at those bases, and they seem to have, in the opening hours of the war, seem to have been evacuated. And from the sort of open source tracking of aircraft movements and tankers, those tanker planes now seem to be operating from bases in the east of Saudi Arabia. Even a load of tankers have gone to Ben Gurion Airport in Israel, Suda Bay in Crete, and interestingly, the Gerald Ford carrier has not gone through the Suez Canal. It is staying in the Eastern Mediterranean, conducting its operations from there. And
I think you raise a really interesting point here, Tim, because this may be, and we're living now in the age of open source intelligence and so forth. Interesting one that, of course, the Chinese are putting out a lot of satellite imagery out in the open. But I think you raised a very interesting point. Fine, they've dispersed because they're aware of the possibility of immediate retaliation. Will the next few days start to see a return to Al Udeid, a return to some of those bases right on the coast of the Gulf? Is that the next thing we're going to see? If so, will that be a sign that, again, Pache, my Israeli friends, either the Iranians, in inverted commas, have run out of the ballistic missiles and cruise missiles, or they are finding it difficult to actually get them into launch positions? Do we think that's the next stage?
Well, the duel is on. I mean, it works both ways here. I mean, this is quite interesting about the attack on Akrotiri. The missile, the drone, we presume it's a drone. They've talked about it being a drone. If it's a Shahed, it's got a potentially 1,500 kilometer range. So that's from western Iran. Now, that suggests that either it got very, very lucky and got through all the fighter patrols over Iraq and Jordan and the Eastern Mediterranean, got through to Akrotiri, or because of this the westward sort of flow of the Allied aircraft, that forward crest of the defences has been weakened. and they haven't got enough or have fewer planes that they can put up to try and shoot down these drones at the forward edge. So you get more leakage. And the interesting thing from this attack on Akrotiri is, does it say something about the effectiveness of the fighter patrols that the Allies have put in place over Iraq, Jordan, Saudi Arabia to try and protect Israel and the Mediterranean region? Back in April 2014, RAF Typhoons, American F-16s, F-15s were shooting down these drones over eastern Iraq and eastern Jordan. If one has got through to the Mediterranean all the way to Cyprus, that either suggests it's very lucky, or that shield of fighters that was used to shoot down the drones back in April 2024 is not as thick, is not as dense, and is not as effective. And is that an implication of the fact that all these tanker planes and all these fighters have had to relocate further east than they did in those days, and they haven't got the planes to maintain those cap stations to protect that region? Well, with that sort of, well, not just sort of, real issue on everybody's mind, perhaps we need to wrap it up for this week. Not this week, maybe this day, and come back again to talk about maybe the naval situation, which we've just seen. I was on the ship tracking websites earlier, and the Strait of Hormuz is empty of tankers. They've all stopped. They're all stacking up inside and outside the Straits of Hormuz. And we are day 2 in here. We're talking about the oil price going through the roof. So the economic impact of the naval situation could be very significant. So that may be the subject for our next discussion on the US-Iran war 2026.